I'm Matt McLaughlin. This is Living History.
A date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor General.
There's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terror attack.
This was their finest hour.
Welcome to Living History. I'm your host, Matt McLaughlin, and I'm really excited about today's podcast. We're going to be talking to Richard Osgood, an archaeologist with the Ministry of Defence in the UK, about work he's been doing on a burial ground in Portsmouth in the UK. These bodies could possibly be prisoners of war from the late 1700s or the early 1800s. They could be convicts who died on ships while awaiting transportation to Australia. So just a really fascinating discovery and a really fascinating discussion with Richard about the fantastic work he does as an archaeologist for the Ministry of Defence. I also wanted to say thank you to everyone who responded in such great numbers about our podcast from last week when we spoke to Will Davies about 1918. It's a topic very close to a lot of people's hearts. A lot of people have family members who served in 1918, and the Australian forces in that year did some absolutely incredible work. And it was wonderful to talk to Will about his upcoming book about 1918. But now, this week, Richard Osgood talking about the convict graveyard that they've uncovered in the UK. So let's hear from Richard. Richard, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Matt, thanks for having me along.
Now, I'm really excited about this. We've been talking about this for a little while. You and I first met about 10 years ago on an archaeological dig, and this work that you do, I mean, all the work you do is fantastic, but this in particular is really exciting. So before we get to the specific discussion about this work you've been doing in Portsmouth, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Tell us what you do with the Ministry of Defence. You're an archaeologist with the Ministry of Defence. I'm sure lots of our listeners didn't even realise the Ministry of Defence employs archaeologists. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Well, that's right, Matt. It's a bit of a curiosity, it might seem, having archaeologists working for the UK MOD, but in Britain we own about 1% of the mainland. We do our military training on that, and as a result we own an awful lot of archaeological monuments, and my job is to help the military get their permissions for training, so to make sure that they get the requisite governmental permits in place for when they build an Afghan training village or when they want to put a tank obstacle in, that sort of thing. But it's also to make sure that they look after the monuments on their training areas as well. And partly also now that the British government has ratified the Hague Convention of making sure that cultural property in overseas territories is protected at times of conflict. That's something that we can build into the training regimes as well. So my team's role is to look after the UK's footprint when it comes to the heritage of the estate, but also when we go overseas in our training, be Kenya or Gibraltar or Cyprus, or even if you get the sunshine trip to Belize, making sure that the guys training have a good understanding of heritage. So that's the day job. And archaeology, doing the actual excavations, is a small part of that.
It sounds really fascinating. I mean, I know that England is pretty much one huge archaeological site, but as you say, the Ministry of Defence owns a lot of land. Are you often encountering historic artefacts, historic sites when you're exploring Ministry of Defence land?
Yeah, I mean, it's where I'm based, Matt. I'm based at a place called Tilshead, one of the main training camps on Salisbury Plain. So I'm calling you from a base that's only 15 minutes from Stonehenge, probably one of the world's most famous archaeological sites. And you'd probably not be surprised that there's loads of archaeology all over that training area. Just last week, we were working on a site where badgers had been digging out little bits and pieces of human remains. And we took a team out there to see what was going on and found that there were 6 Anglo-Saxon burials that they'd been disturbing. Those burials are from the 6th century AD in the UK, and they're pretty gender specific. So you've got chaps buried with spears and pottery, and the women based with jewellery. But really, really lovely stuff. So it's always a thrill to work out on our training areas. And we get to do some pretty weird and wonderful stuff, dating from, Second, First World War right back to early prehistory.
Gee, it's really wonderful stuff. As someone who loves history, as someone who loves archaeology, and living in Australia where obviously there is less archaeology to find, it's just fascinating to think you could get a place where badgers had been digging uncovered Anglo-Saxon burials. It's really fantastic. So I think this is why we want you on the podcast to tell us about these fantastic things that you're doing. The project we wanted to talk specifically about is something that occurred this year at a place called Rat Island. Can you give us a bit of a background about what happened at Rat Island?
Well, with our mainland, we've got a lot of sites that have a load of urban myths appended to them, and they could be things like buried German Kubelwagens or Spitfires in crates, all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And almost 100% of them are urban myths. They're legendary and they're not actually true. And this was the first one I've come across that did have a grain of truth to it. This was just by the naval base in Portsmouth, Rat Island, as you've said. It lies between Gosport and Portsmouth. It's a tidal island. You can only get to it a couple of times a day, unless you've got a combat support boat, which is a very handy piece of kit if you can use it. And we had a report from the local police after some storms in 2014 that human remains had been disturbed on this small tidal island. And when you go out to the island to get the evidence back from the police, they're quite right. They are human bones. And it turns out that there were a series of graves coming out of the cliffside. So I managed to get a certain amount of money, a small budget, to take a team out to investigate this site and to deal with the matters that were eroding pretty rapidly in a 1 week of fieldwork this summer.
Could you tell from the outset that these were old bones, that this wasn't a recent burial?
That's a good question, and that's the sort of call that the police had to make first off. So there were no fillings, which is always a good start when you work on a burial. And you could see they'd clearly been there for a while, just from the coloration and the way they were put into the ground, which had now solidified into sort of a kind of rock formation where it would have been much muddier in the first instance. So pretty apparent straight away that it was an old burial, but the actual style and who these people were was something we had to look at over the fieldwork.
Well, I want to get to, obviously that's the key question, who these people were and how they came to be buried there. And I do want to get to that. But why don't you just so we understand for the novices amongst us, describe the situation, describe what you saw when you got there, the work that you had to do to excavate these bones, and really the whole process of archaeology that went on.
The island itself, it's only exposed, as I said, a couple of times a day. So you have to walk across this causeway. And we knew it was there, so we had to drag all the excavation equipment out there. And it's something you had to do by hand. Getting a digger out there was never going to be a real option because it's just going to sink into the tidal muds. So what we had to do is take all the hand tools out there. And what you see is a certain amount of rock cut graves. These are just over about 2 meters in length and about a half a meter wide in sub-rectangular form. So it looks grave shaped. Even to the novice eye, you'd be able to see that they look the sort of thing a grave would be cut as. And you could see pretty quickly there were 2 or 3 of them just dug into the mud of the foreshore and one cut into the cliff. One of the graves had human bones sticking out, and most of the guys in the team had seen human remains before, so they knew what they were looking for. We had a couple of military police with us and some of our veteran soldiers on the project who've worked with human remains before, as well as the professional archaeologists on the team. So when you get to the site, you then clear the area, make sure it's all nice and clean to work with, and then you just gradually take the soil out until you get to the bones and expose the skeletons. And these ones were in coffins, so they're remains of elm coffins. So there's a bit of a certain ceremonial way of putting into the ground rather than just being chucked into holes. They'd had a degree of decorum when they'd been buried.
So you were uncovering these bones. I mean, I assume you thought it was just going to be a couple of skeletons. You were uncovering them bone by bone. Were they complete skeletons lying in graves? Was it just scattered bones? What did you uncover? For
2 of the burials, we had we had 3 burials that were more or less complete in these coffins, although the legs of one of them had been eroded away. And these coffins are stacked, so you haven't got a single grave that holds one body. You'll have one coffin and then another coffin will be put on top of it to make as much use of the space as possible, because it's quite a small island. And this is also not on consecrated ground, even though they're laid out in a Christian alignment east-west. They're not actually in consecrated graves, they're interparishional, so they're probably just put into the ground as quickly as possible. Maybe it's because they've got diseases or something, you just want to get them out of the way. So you get complete skeletons, although the bottom halves of, I said one of them were eroded away and just washed into the sea. So they're probably floating around the channel somewhere, probably going past the aircraft carriers in the last couple of years. And that was the situation that made it an imperative for us to do this work, because these graves are washing out. The further towards the cliff you get, the more intact they are. But once you've exposed them, you've taken all the sand and the muds off them, you end up with a wooden coffin with a human skeleton in it. And they are quite striking visually when you see them.
Well, let's get to I'm sure the part of the discussion that everyone is most interested in. I mean, who did you think these people could possibly have been at the start when you first started excavating them?
Well, there were 2 real main possibilities for these burials. We looked at them, and the style of burial, the coffins are in, pointed to sort of an 18th, 19th century date. And so forth. You got two real options there. One is that they're prisoners of war, and by the naval base of Portsmouth, you had a real myriad of basically a collection of nations that had fought against the British Empire. This naval base is, of course, how the British Empire was founded, using the power of the Royal Navy. So just opposite where HMS Victory is now stationed, all the ships that had been used to form that empire had brought back prisoners of war, and they brought back Americans, French, Dutch, Germans, Danes, all manner of different nationalities, and they've been incarcerated in prisons all around Portsmouth. Portchester Castle is a very good example. You still got graffiti cut into the castle itself, which is in fact a Roman fortification with some later additions to it. But you still got French Napoleonic graffiti cut into it. Bit like the scene in Gallipoli, I suppose, when you go to the pyramids and you see the graffiti carved in by Napoleon's Grand Army. Carved into the stones there. So you got that sort of thing in Portchester. So that was one possibility.
So just on that subject of the prisoners of war, this potential, I mean, I'm really fascinated by that because, as you say, we're talking late 1700s, early 1800s, and you think about all the conflicts that were going on at that time, everything from Napoleon, Trafalgar, as you say, the American War of Independence. So, I mean, it's just so many. I mean, it was obviously a very violent time. Britain was engaged in a lot of activities at this time. So even that in itself is a huge scope for possibility and a huge scope, obviously, for some sort of international connection with what was going on with these bodies.
It's a real melting pot of humanity in that place. And these, of course, these are generally not officers. The officers were taken as their word would be their bond, and they were given parole. That most of these the officers were allowed to live elsewhere, live in some of the villages of Hampshire nearby. And if you go to the places like Odium or Alresford, you'll see French officers buried in the local cemeteries because they were allowed to live away from these prison ships, whereas the poor bloody infantry, as usual, are treated very differently, and they're stuck on board these prison ships. And it could be for 7 or 8 years. There's a famous book by a well-respected French artist called Louis Garneret, who's incarcerated on a ship called the Prothy for, he says, 7 to 8 years. And that's just an incredible state of being, to be put onto one of these hellish hulks in the middle of an area that's just disease-ridden for that long a period of time. Quite incredible, really.
It certainly is, and I mean, I know you're still investigating these remains, and more evidence will come to light about who these people were. But even that suggestion, I mean, you said the word American. I mean, that would change the whole situation if it turned out these were American prisoners of war from the Revolutionary War, wouldn't it?
It would indeed, and I'm always intrigued at how a nation treats its prisoners of war dead, or its battlefield dead. You've got a very specific way of dealing with it in Australia. I guess Fromell is the example that your listeners are probably most familiar with. But there's a case for lots of the other guys. You were looking at Jack Hunter. I remember that's when we first met many years ago, and the work on Alan Mather. And the Australians certainly have a very different attitude to the Brits, who tend to just leave their war dead where they are. And the French again have a different style of dealing with war dead. Now the Americans actually have a cell based at Hawaii. It's a nice job if you can get it, of bringing everyone back if they find them, and that's generally from the Second and First World Wars and Vietnam and things like that. But we've already discussed with the Americans that if these individuals did turn out to be Americans, they would probably get repatriated. So that's a whole different style of things to if they're not American, basically.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Particularly the way Americans, as you say, treat their war dead and honour their war dead. I've done some work with the American. They used to be called JPAC. Now they've got a much more complicated name. But
that's
basically,
right. JPAC is what we remember. Yeah,
that's the one we always remember. That's now a lot more complicated name. But basically, the teams that go out and actively search for war dead, which is something we, as Australians, and I'm sure as British people, you and I don't really understand just how passionate the Americans are about that. And I've done a lot of work with them on Guadalcanal, where they've been looking for bodies and other Pacific islands. So I think you're right that if the Americans are involved, if these are potentially American bodies, that would be a very different story. But you have a very intriguing theory as well as to who they might be, with quite a strong Australian connection, don't you?
Well, that's right. We've talked about the prisoner of war potential for these human remains, but the other major possibility is that they're in fact prisoners off the prison ships, the great hulks that were there in the late 18th and early 19th century. And there were up to 20 ships in Portsmouth moored around, and these are often the old warships that made the empire. So you think of the Temeraire that had fought at Trafalgar was then converted into a prison ship. They take the masts off and they anchor them to the ground, and then they just have up to 700 or 800 people on these ships. So just
we're
incredible.
Talking convicts here, aren't we? Convicts that were bound for
absolutely
Australia.
Convicts. If your readers are familiar with Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, the prisoner Magwitch is incarcerated on just one of these things. They're shoved onto the ships, put into the sea, and they're kept there. They're brought out to work, but they are convicts, and they're kept there hopefully for not a long period of time prior to transportation to Australia. That's the standard sort of sentence. It could be absolutely brutal. I mean, I think a case in point, I came across a sentence of a child. He was 8 years old, and he was given 7 years as a prison sentence for stealing, I think it was 12 shillings worth of copper. And these were brutal times, and the sentences correspondingly were very, very harsh.
So what an intriguing concept. These could be convicts who were destined to be transported to Australia, who would have potentially become part of Australian society, and eventually, as many of them did, receive their freedom and go on to be the ancestors of many people who live in Australia today. So it's an incredible connection with Australia. And even we just say that word convict, it just carries so much intrigue and so much weight in Australia because it's such an important part of our history. But what you're describing, the life on these hulks, as you called them, these decommissioned ships just moored in the harbour, that must have been a horrific existence.
Oh, it's almost beyond comprehension. These people are given a bed space, and we're talking in a hammock of about 6 foot by about 1.5 foot, and they've got to be incarcerated in these areas. They're not out for many times. If they are taken out, they're shackled, manacled, and taken onto the foreshore to break stones as part of the building process in the harbours. They've got a very limited diet. I think it's meat up to 5 days a week, and then 2 or what are called burgoo days, when you'd get fish given to you, but they're not particularly nice fish, and some fairly poor quality bread. And of course, the contractors providing this are trying to make as much profit as possible, so the bread is low quality, and they're trying to get rid of as much of the poor quality foodstuffs on these people. They've got a prison uniform that's not really up to much. The temperature must have been absolutely bitter. If it's anything like this at the moment, the temperatures in the UK, it must have been a horrendous thing. And of course, if you're incarcerated with 600-700 other people, if disease gets on board these ships, then you are in a lot of trouble, because things like typhus and tuberculosis and cholera really would rip through a prison ship community and would kill an awful lot of them. About 30% of the ship's inhabitants in the early years of the prison hulks were dying. So it really was quite a big problem. And therefore you had to have burial grounds to get rid of the corpses. And that is one possibility of Rat Island. I suppose the thing that makes me really think it may well be a convict burial ground rather than the prisoners of war is one small historic document. It's actually from the Oxford Times of the 1830s, and it refers to a chap called Charles Morris Jones, who was a chap from Aberystwyth in Wales. And he was sentenced to 14 years transportation to Tasmania, but before they could send him over to Australia, he was incarcerated in one of these ships, and he dies. And he dies on the ship, and he's taken over and buried on what the paper describes as the convict burial ground of Rat Island. So that's a good possibility that one of our individuals, at very least, was on his way to Australia, never made it there, and was then buried on the island itself.
So are you leaning more towards the convict theory rather than the prisoner of war theory at this stage?
I think so. From the historic documentation, what will be crucial is to get the scientific backup for this. And what you do is you have a look at the isotopic components of the human bone and the teeth. When you drink in the early years of life, it lays down a very specific composition on the teeth enamel, the geology of the water you drink, and that gives you a lot of information about where you grew up. And that could be very helpful. If it's got an American signature or a French signature, that would set it apart from one of the prisoners who's got a particularly British signature. So that's something we've got to wait on. Matter of interest, we've just had some of the dietary information from the isotopes. Tells you what the guys' diets were like. And it seems as though that the individuals we found hadn't been on the prison ships for any length of time. That's one possibility. Or that the diets they were having on the prison ships were pretty similar to what they'd have had in civil society, because there didn't seem to be any change in diet from the early years of life to their later years of life. So that's just come in as of a couple of days ago. But the crucial thing will be the signature for place of origin. And that's the thing, will be the clincher, whether these guys are expiring on their way to Australia or whether they've come from further afield in the first place.
Isn't that wonderful, the technology we can now use? Why don't you tell us more about that? So you've got bones now. I mean, what's the testing process that's now done to try and work out as much as you can about these people?
It's one of these things. I'm always thankful that there are whizzy scientists that do this, because I'm just a storyteller. Send it away to people at Oxford University who are much more intelligent than I am. And they sample for levels of oxygen, nitrogen and strontium. And those are the critical elements that the laboratories will test for and look for changes in their early years. So they'll look at I think we looked at the arms, which is the humerus of the individual. And we took some samples also of the femurs and also the teeth. So you can see the way that the bones grow, and you can take samples from different parts of the bones and be able to compare the earlier years of life to the later years. Ribs are also very good, where they fuse onto the sternum of the individual. So that's what the scientists are doing. Radiocarbon dating is the other thing, which would give us a little bit of a clue as to the sort of dating of the burials. But of course, there's too big a plus or minus in the standard deviation of when the burials are put into the ground. So giving us a plus or minus 30 or 40 years really isn't going to help us a huge amount. It'll tell us that it's late 18th, early 19th century, but that won't fix it down anymore. So we're just waiting from universities of Oxford and Leuven to give us the information. And there's quite a nice link with previous work that you and I have done, because the burial of Alan Mather, the Australian chap from the 3rd Division, his isotopes were taken by the same two universities to establish whether he was born in Britain or from one other parts of Australia, and help us narrow down who he might be. And that came out with very firmly a signature in New South Wales, which meant we could rule out the Swede, the chap from Essex in England, we could rule out the Scot, and the chap from Western Australia. So these techniques are really useful. And it's a scientific process that's only really come together in the last 10, 15 years. And it's a good argument, maybe, for why human bones are retained and all the different sorts of science you can do as techniques improve.
Absolutely. You mentioned Alan Mather that your team recovered on the Messine battlefield, the Australian soldier. Why don't you tell us just a little bit? It's a little bit of a sideline from that, but a really interesting example of how archaeology and science can work together to identify remains. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about Private Mather and his discovery at Messine?
The discovery of the body that we eventually identified as Alan Mather was found by the archaeological team No Man's Land in 2008. And the way we started was through the histories, really, to look at the position of where the body was found. He was found just by the German frontline trenches. And we looked through all the missing of the various battalions in the area. He was found without officers' equipment. He was found in summer issue kit only. And he was in the attack positions that pretty certainly would have been captured by the 33rd Battalion of the 3rd Australian Division under Monash. So that's where we started. So we looked at all the names on the men in gate and went through the records that you have in Australia that are so brilliant on the National Archives, with the Red Cross records and all those sorts of things. And the fact that you can even go down to the attestation records, it's all online. It's a wonderful resource, as you know. And so we looked at all the different chaps that were missing, looked at the Red Cross records, and we ruled out all of those that said they'd been given a field burial, because the chap we'd found had palpably not been given that. He had all his equipment with him. It's now at the Museum of the Infantry in Singleton. So he would just been hit by shell fire, eviscerated, and covered in the same shell blast, but never given a field burial. That's how we started it. Then the isotopes came in, and it said he was a guy that was palpably from New South Wales. We then had some forensic osteologists look at his remains and said, as opposed to who we initially thought he might have been, who was a 21-year-old soldier called James Millington, this guy was actually in his mid to late 30s, and you can tell that by the way that the bones are fused. In fact, we've done this for Rat Island, so the what we call the epiphyses, the ends of the bones are fused the older you get in life, and the clincher was his voice box, actually, his hyoid bone. That was fused, and that only happens in your early to mid 30s. So that was a good starting component. And once we'd got that, and the fact he was about 5'7" in height, all these little circles you fit on the Venn diagram, we know he's in his 30s, from New South Wales, probably the 33rd Battalion, then it really narrows it down to a level where the Australian Army could then have a look at doing some DNA tests. And they managed to get a fix from a woman called Kath Mitchell, who she only died 2 years ago, well over 100 years of age, and she came back with a direct match for her DNA. Therefore, it was Alan James Mather. He was buried in 2010 with full military honours, and it was just an extraordinary experience to be burying someone for whom you've now got a photograph of him in life. That's the sort of connection that you don't really get when you work on Anglo-Saxon sites, as I were last week. It's a real proximity story that fascinates me, and you and I share a passion about the history and heritage of the Great War, and I think that that's never going to go away.
It's a really wonderful story about Alan Mather, and I know I've spoken to everyone on your team, and we can tell from listening to how you talk about him, and the rest of the team is the same, that you feel very strongly connected to him. And, on behalf of all of us in Australia, I think it's a wonderful example of how archaeology and science can work to bring people a proper burial. So it's a thank you from us in Australia for the work you did with Alan Mather, because he is now buried at Prowse Point Cemetery in Belgium, if I recall correctly. And now we go and visit that grave on our tours, and it's really wonderful to see the work you did there. So thank you very much for the work you did with Alan Mather. Coming back to Rat Island, I mean, what did you find any artifacts with these people, or was it purely skeletons? I mean, obviously after all this time, there's not going to be any clothing. Were there any artifacts that indicated who they might be?
That's a good question. There's nothing in any of the coffins themselves, although you do get the odd bit and piece in coffins of that era, but these ones had nothing in them at all. All around the coffins, though, and probably in the right stratigraphic layers, so contemporary with the burials, you find lots and lots of clay pipes, and that could have been by the work gang that are putting the bodies into the ground, or it could have been actually their own kit that's thrown into the graves nearby. It's just that they've been so disturbed we couldn't really tell. You've also got a lot of gaming tokens. These are little figures made of metal, a bit like the figures you get on the game set of Monopoly, like the dog and the boot and the hat and things like that. But these are used on the ships. And gambling was a real problem for the British authorities, both for prisoners and prisoners of war. And people are gambling away their rations or their clothing and creating a real underclass on the ships. And you think of prison dramas being run, with prisons being run by a head individual. I'm wanting to not mention cell block H or anything like that, but there's a real kind of person in charge. And that's the same sort of hierarchy that happened on the ships, and gambling was really feeding into that. Another thing that the prisoners of war were making, they were trying to augment their meagre rations by making artwork out of even bones from the meat ration, or doing paintings and selling them to the local communities. And that's the sort of thing you do find near burials of prisoners of war, certainly at Porchester. We didn't find anything like that on Rat Island. Only things, as I said, were the clay pipe bowls and stems. Two of the skeletons have got quite interesting evidence for wear on their teeth, which if they put the teeth together in a bite, you'd see a circle worn into them onto the left-hand side, and that's where they've been smoking clay pipes over so many years that had actually worn down the enamel of the teeth to have a little circle in so that the pipe stem would fit in. So I suppose smoking damages your health in many ways, but having a clay pipe stem worn into your mouth would really be quite something for your portrait anyway.
Isn't it incredible what comes out, these little facets of information about their life and painting a picture of what went on, the smoking, the clay pipes, the gaming tokens. I mean, it tells us so much more than just than just examining the mere objects themselves, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And it's all about people, isn't it? History and archaeology is all trying to get back to that human story. And I think by having as much information about these individuals, they're not just skeletons, they are the remains of people, and trying to get back to their individual stories. And you come across all manner of little traces and lovely connections between Britain and Australia that there have been for so many years. I mentioned to you, I'm speaking to you from Salisbury Plain, and not far from my office, you've got a memorial to a highwayman out on the training area. It's called the Robber's Stone, and it commemorates a position where a chap called Benjamin Colclough, who'd taken money off of Mr. Dean of the village of Imber, set across Salisbury Plain and been chased down by a posse, and he collapses on Salisbury Plain. And this position is marked on this very bleak bit of landscape, big stone with a metal plaque on it with full of self-righteous religious language like the deeds of the wicked shall destroy them, all this sort of stuff. And not only does it commemorate Colclough, but also his three, as they called it, companions in iniquity. And these guys were apprehended a short while after Colclough's death, and they were indeed transported to Tasmania. They never came back to Britain. They stayed for the rest of their lives in Australia. And there the story might end. But if we draw him back to another urban legend, the Dean family still lived in Imber in the period of the First World War. And as you well know, half the world descends on Salisbury Plain to train in the Great War. You had Canadians, you have New Zealanders, including lots of their Maori pioneers, you have Newfoundlanders, and of course the Australians are there on the plain. One night in Edinburgh itself, the Dean family has a knock on the door, and there are a series of Australian troops who claim to be the descendants of these people who've been deported and demanding drinks with menaces. It's almost certainly an urban myth, but like the best urban myths, they should be true. But it does nonetheless reflect this brilliant connection, and it sort of squares the circle in many ways and brings back people back to Britain as transport has changed, and the families who'd been moved over to Australia, probably for some very, very minor crimes, were coming back to help fight for Britain and its empire later on. It's strange how things work out.
It certainly is, and it's just such an important part of both our histories, this idea that England was busy sending away what the British viewed as their worst parts of society, and then these same people forging a new society in Australia. And it's just such an important part of both our histories, which is why this discovery on Rat Island, I think, is so compelling. It's just such an interesting story. As we say, if only these bones could speak, if only they could tell us what their story was. But hopefully the science that your team is doing is going to reveal some more of that story. You spoke about Private Mather, that your team uncovered a First World War burial, an Australian on the battlefields of Belgium. You and I were involved the year before with the discovery of the 5 soldiers at West Hoke as well, who are also identified with DNA. You've mentioned Fromell. I can just tell from hearing you talk about it, Richard, that you feel a very strong connection to these people. Was it the same with a discovery like the discovery on Rat Island that's a little bit older? As you say, you don't have a photo of these people. You don't have a direct connection to them like you do with a First World War or a Second World War burial. When you're there and, on this what I imagine is a, fairly exposed beach uncovering these bones, do you feel a connection to these people? Or for you, is it just purely a piece of science or a day job?
I think it's really important that there's empathy when you're dealing with human remains. You're never encountered with more pathos than when you're working with human bodies, because that's where we're all going to go one day. So there's got to be a huge amount of respect when you work with human remains on a site. Now, that could be Roman, it could be prehistoric, it could be Saxon, it could be Rat Island, or First World War. There is a proximity component with dealing with First World War dead, in that you could have photographs. Conceivably, they could have children that are still alive today, and we have our own personal narratives and stories that connect us with the First World War. I think nearly everyone in one of your listeners will have a family story connected with the First World War, so there is a real closeness with that. But that isn't necessarily diminished with Rat Island or previous sites. I think we're all looking at these bodies, and we've got that natural human curiosity of looking at them, thinking, why were they put into the ground? What was their crime, if anything? You can just imagine the grief of their families when they find out that their loved one is dead and not even going to have the transportation sentence carried out. They're dead even before that's happened. So they're very poignant moments, and I would hope that most archaeologists, I would hope all archaeologists and indeed historians, when they're dealing with that sort of thing, would have a huge amount of respect when they do these sorts of things. I think time does change things. Perhaps there's the closeness of the First World War and the fact that you might have a photograph, such as with the chaps at West Hook or Alan Mather. You get a photograph of that individual. We're never going to get that for a Victorian site, but nonetheless, I think human remains, there's a real fundamental there.
And what happens now to the remains? What testing is still to be done? And once that's completed, once we know as much as we possibly can about who these people were, what happens to their bodies then?
The next stage is the isotopic testing, as we've discussed. So we'll find out place of origin, and that might affect what happens to the remains. If they're Americans, they might well go back. If they're French, the French authorities here might have a feeling on how the remains are treated. If they turn out to be prisoners from the prison ships, once we've finished all the reporting that's required and we photographed all the necessary elements, then we will rebury them. We'll find a place of consecrated ground, and they will then go into the ground, and that will be the closure of that particular story. Although my bet is that there are still more burials on that island that will yield their secrets in years to come.
Well, it's just such a wonderful story, Richard, and thank you for sharing it with us. Just before we go, are there other exciting new projects coming up, whether it's Convict, as a World War I, World War II? I mean, what's on the horizon for Richard Osgood and your team of hardy archaeologists?
Well, we should have a packed year next year, subject to me getting a budget. Hopefully, we'll be going back to our Anglo-Saxon cemetery, partly investigated by the Badgers. I think there'll be more burials there that are currently being tracked over by Challenger tanks and armoured vehicles, and I just want to make sure that those things are not getting affected by the weighting of those things. So we'll have a look at those. And then in the summer, back for a second season, if the French authorities give us the thumbs up at the battlefield site of Bullecourt, the 1917 action where the British tanks fought alongside the Australian 4th Division, not entirely successfully, as I think we both know, and just to see if we can trace the last resting place of any of those tanks from the April 1917 battle, which have been partially mapped out by Charles Bean, and to see how they correlate with the Hindenburg line that all the very famous Australian people attacked in that very fateful battle. It's just got so many wonderful characters to it, be it Jacker or Percy Black, or indeed actually some of the tank commanders themselves. It's a really intriguing story. So we'll hopefully be there in the summer to find out a little bit more about that 1917 action.
Well, that's wonderful. I'm sure that our listeners will be very interested to hear about any discoveries that you make at Bullecourt, and I think that's a great opportunity for a future podcast episode to talk about what's going on there at Bullecourt. But it's been really fascinating, Richard. Thank you for all your insights into this incredible discovery on Rat Island, whether they turn out to be prisoners of war or indeed convicts who were due for Australia. It's just such a fascinating story. So thank you so much for joining us and telling us all about it.
My pleasure. Lovely to speak with you, Matt.
I think you'll agree with me that was incredibly fascinating. This is just parts of my job that I love, hearing people like Richard who are passionate and absolute experts in their field, and these incredible discoveries that they're making all around the world. It's really exciting. It's a really wonderful aspect of history. I'm going to put some photos of the dig up on the show notes page, so you'll be able to see those and see Richard and his team excavating these bones and see images of what is a really fascinating discovery, and hopefully we'll learn more about it as time goes on, and we'll discover exactly who these people are and give them the burial that they deserve. Coming up in the future, we've got some excellent podcasts, so please subscribe. Please review us on iTunes if you're enjoying listening to the podcasts. I'm really enjoying making them, and it's always when we get that feedback that we can improve and keep making great content. So please feel free to review, please feel free to leave a rating, and also visit our website, battlefields.com.au, where we talk all about ways to visit battlefields all over the world. So I hope to see you over on the battlefields one day. And until next week's podcast, thanks for listening.